where the Wolverines stand coming out of training camp as we head into Game 1 next on Michigan Podcast.
But there's going to be one team that's going to play solely as a team. No man is more important than the team. No coach is more important than the team. The team, the team, the team.
Looks deep for Anthony Clark. Waits for it. It's caught.
This is no time for that. In the pocket and a sack. Tim Jamison.
Brady gets terrific. Throws it and a touchdown. Knight again. Schultz just before Brazil got him. And a leaping interception by Woodson.
Harbaugh back to throw over the middle. Caught by Collier at the 5 on his feet. Touchdown, Michigan. On its way. It's good.
He's 5'7", 179 pounds, a junior at Michigan. But Jamie Morris hacks a wall of him, and he delivers for Bo Schembechler.
And here's your first play. Pressure coming. Second. It is Glenn Steele, number 81, who fought his way through the traffic.
Option. And Robinson calls his own number, and he's going to score. Oh, an easy touchdown for Ron Robinson and Michigan.
We're going to win the championship again because we're going to play as a team. And when we play as a team and the old season is over, you and I know it's going to be Michigan again. Michigan.
Greetings, Go Blue, and can you believe it? It is finally here. Our long national nightmare is officially over. It is game week as our beloved Michigan Wolverines get set to take on the Florida Gators at Jerry World on Saturday, 3:30 Eastern. David Waters from Gator Breakdown will be here with us to break it down, coming up on this week's episode of Michigan Podcast, and so much more. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at Michigan Podcast. Our goal this week, in honor of Game Week, I even busted out the maize jersey. All right, that's how much we want to reach the goal this week of getting over 1,000 subscribers on YouTube. Help to push us over that line in celebration of the kickoff of the 2017 season. Subscribe right here on our YouTube channel. You can also get the audio-only podcast, courtesy of our friends at Detroit Sports Podcast, via iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play as well. Thank you for subscribing that way too. And don't forget, if you want to support what we do here, you can join us on Patreon. And this week, we're going to debut for our Patreon subscribers, we're going to debut 2 new features: my weekly picks, my official game breakdown and prediction for the Wolverines, as well as my best bet point spread picks across the country. Those are going to debut later this week on our Patreon account at Michigan Podcast. And then we'll have the audio instant reaction podcast after every Michigan game this year, including this Saturday against the Florida Gators. All that and more. And you can always keep up to date with everything we do at MichiganPodcast.com. Well, let's get started. Training camp is over. Here's where I think the team stands heading into the season opener against the Florida Gators. The first thing, we got to start with the good news. Now, let's knock on wood, which means I'm also going to knock on my own head here. Knock on wood. No major injuries. That is always the first priority in any camp. I always go to Drew Henson in 2000. Remember his injury? We had to start John Navarre about a year earlier than we were planning on, right? So whenever you get out of camp with no major injuries, that's always your number one priority. Look at a Tennessee losing their best linebacker, Darren Kirkland, for example. Wisconsin losing 2 linebackers, including maybe their best overall player in the program in Jack Sitchie. Yes, that's the number one priority in any fall camp. Get out without any major injuries, and we did that. That leads us to number 2. Wilton Spate has reportedly stepped up this fall from his spring performance, which wouldn't take much. That's also good news, though, because we need to have him have a big year. Last year, he got to be Jake Delhomme. He got to be Trent Dilfer. He got to be the game manager. Now, this year, we don't need him to be Aaron Rodgers because he ain't. But he's going to have to be a little bit more. Maybe an Eli Manning, maybe a Matthew Stafford. Going to have to be a little bit more than Jake Delhomme or Trent Dilfer this year. We've got so many young guys being counted on offense. He's now the bell cow. He's the beacon now. He's not the guy that just, gets out of the way and lets those promising and proven veterans make the plays. He's got to be the one that leads the way. Number 3, by all reports, the defensive front 7 is young, but is as advertised. And the reason I put in the whole front 7 there is because I think it's the whole package. I think when you look at Devin Bush, Mike McCray, who moves very well for a man of his size, Khaleke Hudson, who I think is going to have a monster year at the Viper, and of course that celebrated defensive line. This week Pro Football Focus came out and said that among defensive ends returning in the country, Chase Winovich actually led the nation in pressures per snaps played by a defensive end in college football. And he's the other guy. All right, he's not Rashawn Gary. He's not Maurice Hurst. And Brian Monet, if he's healthy, I think is finally poised to have the kind of year that's been expected of him really the last 2 years. So that entire defensive front, I think, is scary, which is good. And don't sleep on the kicking game. That is always a major facet. We forget how good Kenny Allen was the last 2 years, minus that one game against Wisconsin. Dude was cash money, homie, the last 2 years. And if you look at Coach Harbaugh's career, both in college and also with the 49ers in the NFL, place kickers get a lot of opportunities to score points in Jim Harbaugh offenses. So that's key for this year is Quinn Nordine. Can he be the guy worthy of sleeping over at his house to get him to sign on the dotted line? We're going to find out week 1 because this week Coach Harbaugh said he is definitely handling point after touchdowns as well as the field goals. So when you're healthy and you're good to great at quarterback and on the defensive front, you have a chance to win every game. I mean, those are the building blocks right there. The 2 most important spots for a college football team, quarterback and the defensive front. I think Michigan can be good at quarterback. I think they can be great on the defensive front. When you have those 2 things going for you in today's college football, then you pretty much have a chance to win every single game on your schedule. Now to things that I'm kind of neutral on based on what we're being told coming out of camp from various websites like the Michigan Insider, the Wolverine, and others. What are they telling us? I'm going to try to do this as benign as I possibly can because, those folks make their money on their premium content, so we don't want to steal their stuff. So I'll give you some general analysis. The wide receivers. I know there's all kinds of hype about them. They have elite recruiting profiles. This might be the best wide receiver class since we brought in Marquise Walker and David Terrell. But keep in mind, this is one of the toughest positions in college football for first-year players to make an impression. That includes the NFL. Remember Calvin Johnson's rookie year with the Lions? You always knew when it was going to be an end around because he was in the game, all right? First-year receivers, that's a tough spot. You got to get the timing down with your quarterback. You got to be able to recognize coverages, etc. So I'm not going to say skeptical. How about we just say, let's pump the brakes a little bit. I think this could go down as one of the best receiving corps Michigan's had in my lifetime when it's all said and done. But it's not all said and done. In fact, it's just getting started. And we got to also remember this. The glowing reports we're getting about our young receivers, where they're going against the biggest unknown on the team every day in practice. And that's the secondary, right? So anytime your team, you've been told, hey, one of our players came out this week and told the media, we had a great defensive practice, man. We got like 3 or 4 interceptions. Great. Except the problem was the guys who threw those interceptions were wearing Michigan uniforms as well. So you have to take those reports, particularly when we're dealing with guys who haven't proven it on the field. Now, the defensive line guys, we know those guys are good. So they've proven it on the field against guys wearing the other uniform. These wide receivers haven't done it yet. All we're hearing is what they're doing against guys also wearing their uniform. So let's get to Saturday before we start waving the palm branches. That's all I'm saying. So I'm not pessimistic on the wide receivers. I just want to see it in games first. Luckily, even without Devin Asiasi and the loss of one of the great tight ends in school history, Jake, but the tight end position is stacked. And so that's going to alleviate some of the pressure on those young wide receivers. In fact, I go back to something I heard Nick Saban say many years ago as a defensive guru, that he would much rather cover, in college anyway, at the collegiate level, he'd much rather have to deal with an elite wide receiver than elite tight ends. Because linebackers at the collegiate level tend to struggle more in space and in pass coverage than your defensive backs do. And it's not like we don't have any experience as Michigan fans with that, right? Jonas Mouton, Obieze. Remember those lost in space years with our linebackers? Yeah, Nick Saban kind of knows what he's talking about there. Let's continue with the team. Neutral is where I'm at on the offensive line as well. I think we're going to be stronger and more athletic there. But I think that unit is probably more about cohesion than anything else. And these are going to be 5 guys that haven't played together yet. Okay, so that is something to keep in mind about the offensive line. These are 5 guys that, I think Michael Onwenu has to be stronger than what we played at right guard last year because it probably couldn't get weaker. But that doesn't mean they're ready to play together yet as a group. These guys haven't played a meaningful snap together yet as a group. So again, I like what I'm hearing on that side of the ball. They've also had a chance to go up against the strongest unit on the team every day in practice on the defensive front. That's going to make you better just right then and there. But let's see it in a game first. Let's see it in a game when the guys are wearing the other team's uniforms and they don't know what's coming. Okay? Let's see it in the games first. And I'm also neutral on the running backs because until we see a bell cow in games, we don't have one. We have guys in Ty Isaac with huge recruiting profiles that just haven't really developed. I think Chris Evans is a game breaker and showed that last year, averaging 7 yards a carry. But I'm still not convinced he's ready to be a tote the rock 20 times kind of guy quite yet. You have Kareem Walker, who is a big-time recruit. We'll talk more about him here in just a little bit. And then you have Karan Higdon, who's one of the X factors on the team, who in terms of explosion and body type looks like the prototype for the bell cow that you're looking for, but we've not really seen him put it together all together in games yet either. So that's why I'm still neutral on the running backs. As we continue our post-camp evaluation of the Wolverines, I point out, hey, we're deep and talented at the running back position. But at some point, someone's got to get a first down on 3rd and 3. Who's that guy going to be? Right now, we just don't know. And that brings me to my biggest concern. Really my only concern. Now, that doesn't mean we're a team without weaknesses. Okay, but given how much turnover we supposedly had, really the only concern I have is the secondary. Because we were relying on players who didn't get a lot of opportunity to play last year. We saw Devin Bush play a lot last year. Okay, we didn't really see Lavert Hill play a lot last year. Saw him play in some spot duty, some. Didn't really see David Long play a lot last year. We saw Tyree Cannell play a lot last year. I like what we saw. We saw Josh Metellus play in the Orange Bowl, had some moments, had some others that weren't so good. But we have a dangerous combination of low numbers and experience back there. And so this is why the secondary is the one unit I'm concerned about. Now, let me say this, though. I'll temper this concern with this statement. If you were to ask really any coach in America, would they rather have a questionable secondary and a stud defensive front or a questionable defensive front and a stud secondary? I can promise you. If you put Wonder Woman's lasso of truth around every Division I head coach, they would all say they would rather have the stud defensive front than the questionable secondary. So if we're going to have an area on defense to have questions about, you don't want to have questions anywhere, right? But, that would mean you're like the 72 USC Trojans, okay? So if you're going to have questions on defense, that's where you want those questions to be. Plus, when you look at our schedule, you just don't see too many all Big Ten or NFL prospects at quarterbacks. Probably don't see any of those all Big Ten prospects until Penn State, middle of the season. And nonetheless, though, if there's a game we lose at some point that maybe we otherwise shouldn't, where there's a mental breakdown and a key play gets made at our own expense, that's probably the unit where that's going to occur. So that remains the one real concern I have about this year's team. Well, now that we've taken a look at where things stand for the Wolverines coming out of training camp, what about our opening week opponent, the Florida Gators? We're going to get a breakdown from David Waters of Gator Breakdown next on Michigan Podcast.
Michigan Podcast Trivia. When was the last time Michigan football won a season opener outside of Ann Arbor?
Back here on Michigan Podcast, and we want to introduce you to our new partners here on Michigan Podcast, Sport Court. I mean, take a look at that with the maize and blue jump man. That is sweet. And if you're looking to put the ball in your court, your actual court, Sport Court of Michigan has you covered. Yeah, they even do that green and white thing too. They do that too. From basketball to tennis to batting cages to hoops, if you need anything athletic in your backyard, give them a call. Based out of Michigan, ready to install your court sooner than you'd expect. If you're in the Southeast Michigan area or in Ann Arbor, Tim Barnes will personally walk you through the process of having your dreams of a professional court in your backyard if you visit Sport Court MI, that's MI for Michigan, sportcourtmi.com. If you're outside of Southeast Michigan, you need a hoop in your driveway or yard, he's got you covered at monsterhoops.com. That's monsterhoops.com, and they'll ship those right to your door. Mention Michigan Podcast. You're going to save $100 on Monster Hoop. $100 on a Monster Hoop if you mention Michigan Podcast, and if you mention us at sportcourtmi.com, Sports Courts of Michigan, you're going to save up to $1,000 on a backyard game court just by telling them Michigan Podcast sent you. And now, a preview of our first opponent, the Florida Gators. David Waters joins us from Gator Breakdown. And David, my name is Steve Dace. Welcome to Michigan Podcast. It's an honor to have you with us.
Hey, thanks for having me. Been looking forward to this big game for a few years now, and it's almost kickoff time. In week one, all these big games, but to us, this is the marquee game.
Before we get into the matchup specifically and we start comparing, the personnel, I was listening to SiriusXM's college football channel this morning, and Rick Neuheisel, the former Washington, UCLA, Colorado coach, does the mid-morning show on there, and they were talking about your coach, Jim McElwain, and playing some audio of exchanges he had with the media yesterday. We got really surly about, this isn't exactly award-winning journalism, asking me if a guy with a marijuana arrest is going to get suspended or not. Harbaugh, had to do those antics to make Michigan relevant. I wouldn't act that way. And they were making a big deal that this just seems like a different Jim McElwain than the one that they remember taking over at Florida a couple years ago, that he's not as jovial, as happy-go-lucky as he was at Colorado State, that maybe he's either, he's kind of losing it because maybe the fans down there aren't appreciative of him as they should be with back-to-back SEC East titles, or he's trying to become more like his former mentor Nick Saban when he was the Alabama offensive coordinator. You're down there on the scene locally. What's your read of this, David? Are we making too much out of this?
I don't think you're making too much out of it. I think there are some happenings there with Jim McElwain to put him to a point to where he acts like this. And a lot of this really came from, and I hate to bring it up again, but, just a few months ago in that shark photo that was, shared out around, and that really got him upset. The people went after him about that. And, a lot of people really knew it wasn't him, but it was a way to test the Florida fans and the Florida faithful, and he had to address it with his higher ups there at Florida to really tell them it was not him. It was just something he really didn't want to have to deal with as a football coach, with a meme or photo that goes out there and really takes hold in social media and gets spread from everywhere. So I think that a couple months ago was part of probably the spark that kind of lit this fire into Jim McElwain, to where he's kind of not too happy with the way social media and media in general kind of works itself now. So, and the question that was asked yesterday about James Robinson because of the marijuana issue last week, and now he's suspended for the Michigan game, that's a question that has to be asked. Nothing was out there that said he was going to be suspended for this game. And, it was a colleague of mine that I know very well who asked that question, and he's on the top of his game. But it's a question that had to be asked because we didn't know. Yes, we assumed he wouldn't play, but there was no answer behind that. So, James Robinson is suspended, and he should be, but, Jim McElwain probably should not have gotten upset about that question that was asked there. Now, for the Harbaugh stuff, it's just I don't really get that either. I know there's a little bit of irkness there with not releasing a roster and all that stuff, but with McElwain, I probably would have not said anything about Harbaugh and relevancy or whatever. Harbaugh's record at Michigan for these last couple of years speaks for itself, and you got your butt kicked in a couple of years in the bowl game. So if it was McElwain, I'd probably just kind of trying to take it in stride. That's kind of what he does most of the time. But I think really starting with that shark photo and the media storm behind that, he's kind of just taking a different approach right now.
Why did the shark photo thing? Why did that irritate him? In another life, in my day job, it calls for me to be active on social media at times to give controversial opinions in the political sphere. I've been memes. I've been called every name in the book. And, I'm not at the same level of notoriety, obviously, as the University of Florida football coach, but you just have to learn that same social media in his line of work that helps you maybe to introduce your brand to recruits who a few years ago you couldn't reach. Well, you live by the sword, you die by the sword. You're probably just better off laughing that stuff off, right? I mean, you take a non-story that went viral, and instead of making a joke about it, which helps you kind of essentially claim it and own that story, acting like, my kids were like offended and it really hurt our family. That's exactly what the Reddit world on social media, that's the reaction they're looking for. You're feeding those trolls, David.
Yeah, you're right. It did start that way a little bit. He did kind of jokingly ask about it, but it was on this, the summer camp tours that coaches have to do, and it was just something that was brought up time after time after time. And I think eventually it just ate away at him, and it got to a point to where it should have been done, but it kept being brought up, and then it kind of died down a little bit, and then here come SEC Media Days, and it's brought up again by national media that didn't get a chance to talk to Jim McElwain about it yet. So with all the national media there being in the SEC Media Days, and they weren't around these local tour stops that he gets to do, of course it was going to be brought up again. He should have expected it. And you know what? When College Game Day rolls around come this week, even though game day's in Atlanta with FSU and Alabama, you better expect there's going to be a whole bunch of shark photos of Jim McElwain. If Florida gets a game day this year, especially if it's at an opponent stadium, there's going to be even more about it. This is not dying down anytime soon. Luckily, the football season is here. Maybe he can shut himself around his football team and get ready. But, hopefully this isn't a distraction. It's kind of once camp started, a lot of Florida fans have forgotten about it, of course. But, when you're bringing up how McElwain's been acting and it's kind of been a trend lately, that's just kind of where it started.
Talking with David Waters from Gator Breakdown here on Michigan Podcast. Andy Staples, as you well know from Sports Illustrated, he's their chief college football writer, a Florida grad. I think he played on a national championship team at Florida under Steve Spurrier as a walk-on, if memory serves. He has an interesting theory about your fan base and Coach McElwain, in that when Jim was hired coming off the disastrous Will Muschamp era, if you would have told those fans, the Gator fans, the day he was brought in, you're going to win the SEC East the next 2 years, they would have taken that hands down without even thinking twice right then and there. And that's exactly what Coach McElwain has done. But Staples' theory is the reason why maybe your fan base hasn't really rallied around him is whether it's Urban Meyer and the power spread and the fun and gun under Steve Spurrier, that really since Spurrier resurrected Florida coming out of the probations and Galen Hall years of the late 80s, really since Spurrier resurrected that program with Shane Matthews and then on into Danny Werfel and the rest of those teams we saw over the years, Rex Grossman and the like, that there's a certain expectation with Florida fans. That you guys expect a certain level of offensive acumen, a certain level of offensive output execution, and that it's not just wins and losses, but it's style points. And I get this as a Michigan fan because I think one of the things that we really underrated about the Rich Rodriguez era is just how much our fan base had become accustomed to saying 22 packages and a fullback, right? And running the ball down the hill and play action passes. And that was kind of our brand. And it took a while for us to recover that. And Harbaugh comes back in and, of course, resurrects that brand. Is there some truth to that theory by Andy Staples of what's going on down there with your program and the coach and the fan base?
There is some truth to that, and I don't think the majority of the fan base thinks that way. I think the majority of the fan base are Jim McElwain supporters and are completely happy with what we've seen the last 2 years by winning the SEC East. Now, there have been disappointments toward the end of the season when you get blown out by Florida State and you get blown out by Alabama in the SEC championship game the very next week, where, two back-to-back weeks, 2 years in a row, where your team doesn't look capable of hanging with the big boys of college football right now. Florida is a big boy of college football. historically speaking, for these last 3 decades. But now you go up against FSU, your biggest in-state rival, and Alabama in the SEC championship game, and you can't hang. So, and Jim McElwain was hired, as you said, to fix the offense. We went through the downtrodden era of Will Muschamp and couldn't get anything going on offense, couldn't get a quarterback. And McElwain was supposed to come in and fix that. That's why he was hired. There was not another defensive coach hired. It was an offensive coach hired to fix this offense. So while he did play to his strengths, and that's one thing you have to give him credit for, look at the quarterback situation. He went from Will Greer, who looked like it was on its way. He had found his quarterback. This Florida offense was on fire.
That game against Ole Miss, when Ole Miss was like number 2 in the country, right? You guys named the score against them a few years ago.
Right, and the week before that, you had the fourth quarter comeback against Tennessee at home. The very next week, as you mentioned, the Ole Miss game where you was going crazy. You could name your play, you could name your score. Everything was happening right, and recruits were in the swamp. Those 2 straight weeks in a row, and Florida was the hot program the first half of the season under Jim McElwain. But then, it all came to a screeching halt with the suspension of the PED usage of Will Greer, and now you're stuck with Treon Harris, who's not a fit for Jim McElwain's offense. So moves on from that, brings in transfers Luke Del Rio, Austin Appleby, just because there was nothing there. That was what you had to do. You were not going to start a true freshman in Felipe Franks last year. It was the right move, but it was going to be ugly. Now, could it have looked better at times? Him being an offensive coach, of course it can. But there were some limitations. Offensive line had to be completely retooled. His first year there was 6 offensive linemen that were holding with a spring game his first season. Depth there is now better. Wide receiver depth is now better. You have some playmakers at running back. This is the year. Year 3 is the year it has to take off. There are no more excuses. These are your players. This is your quarterback. You can't put any more on Will Muschamp. I'll give him a pass for the first 2 years. I understand the issues that he faced, and he played to a strength of a great defense. Vernon Hargraves, Marcus May, Jalen Tabor, Quincy Wilson. Those names are now in the NFL, and those guys' names are going to be in the NFL for a while now. He played to his strengths, but it's year 3. Him and a guy you know very well, Doug Nussmeier, have to get something together for this Florida offense in year 3. There's no more excuses, and it starts with Michigan. And it doesn't have to be a blowout of Michigan, but you need to show somewhat that in these big games, like I mentioned, FSU, Alabama, you're playing a power opponent, you need to show that you can do something on offense.
You mentioned Doug Nussmeier. Of course, that's a name we know very well as Michigan fans. This guy's a very accomplished offensive coordinator, but when he was brought in to essentially save Brady Hoke's job for the 2014 season, he's a West Coast offense guy. And you've got, Devin Gardner sitting there, who in his junior year was the Walter Camp National Player of the Week for the way he lit up Notre Dame in Michigan's second ever night game the previous season, was a very accomplished dual-threat quarterback, one of the top dual-threat quarterback prospects in the country coming out of high school, and they really tried to force him into that offense and force him into that system, and we had offensive line woes, and it just didn't work, and it was a disaster, and that was the season they got Brady Hoke fired. And that has been the question. I brought this up from the early episodes of our debut here on Michigan Podcast, David, because it was right about the time the whole Malik Zaire thing was being decided. And that's my concern, I see a player very similar to Devin Gardner in Malik Zaire, even academically. Devin Gardner was an elite student at Michigan. Malik Zaire could have gone, I think it was to Yale or Harvard. I think that was one of his final choices, along with Texas and Florida when he left Notre Dame. And Notre Dame is an elite academic school. So the similarities are striking. And what worried me was so you mean to tell me you're going to bring a guy, and when we brought in Jake Rudock a few years ago, he ran the same offense at Iowa, just the terminology, but literally the same pro-style offense that he was going to run at Michigan. So you're going to bring Malik Zaire in. He's not a West Coast quarterback. You mean to tell me you're going to revamp your offense middle of June for a season that starts with a national power in Michigan for game 1? I've always been skeptical that they were going to be able to pull that off in the best of circumstances. And now McElwain says, well, maybe all 3 guys. Luke Del Rio may play. You mentioned Felipe Franks was a big recruit for you guys last year, but then redshirted. What's the real story? Because you obviously know Wilton Spate's the starter at Michigan. There's no mystery there. Harbaugh, I just think, is just doing that because he's Harbaugh. But are you really going to play 3 quarterbacks on Saturday?
I don't think so. I do see 2. I do see Felipe Franks or Luke Del Rio getting the start, and right now I'll say Felipe Franks. And I do think you get Malik Zaire in certain situations, whether it be 3rd and short to convert some yardage plays, some red zone where Florida has struggled getting in the red zone, get him, see if he can be a playmaker there. And also with this Michigan defensive line, who to me is the biggest strength of the team right now, especially going against this Florida offensive line, you're going to need to keep this Michigan defensive line off balance, and there's a good way of doing that with some quarterback runs and design quarterback runs, some zone reads, some read option from Malik Zaire. So I do think Felipe Franks gets to start, but I do think you see plenty of Malik Zaire. The only way I think 3 quarterbacks do play is if it's predetermined you bring in Luke Del Rio off the bench. I don't think that's a good idea, especially if Felipe Franks is playing well, or even if he's not playing well and you pull him, and maybe there goes his confidence the first game of the season. But I think you go with Franks, you ride him, you bring in Zaire to be a change of pace. It does seem since camp has started that Malik Zaire, as you mentioned, this was my biggest detriment as well. If he can come in June and be the quarterback Florida names as a starter, what does that really say about the other quarterbacks, Felipe Franks, Luke Del Rio? If he can come in right away and lead this offense and be named starter that quickly. I didn't like that. I didn't really like that the way that could have played out. So it's played out probably the best way it could. With Felipe Franks probably taking the reins. That's my prediction right now. But Malik Zaire just can't seem to get the timing down right now. Doesn't really fully know the playbook. So maybe he gets better as the season goes on once he's got some more experience in this offense. But game 1, I really do expect Felipe Franks to take there. So with Doug Nussmeier, and we talked about him, another thing that got me worried, and what you talked about with Devin Gardner, and we kind of saw it here with Florida as well, with Treon Harris, was it was a square peg in a round hole. They were trying to make him something he was not. And McElwain did kind of mention at one time they didn't want to make a focus on Treon Harris so much where it was a detriment to the other 10 players on the field. McElwain knew the offense he wanted to build, and he wasn't going to let the quarterback hold it behind in the first season. So they rode Treon Harris for as long as they could. It didn't work out. Some other off-field issues happened. He's now gone. But Doug Nussmeier, Jim McElwain didn't necessarily cater to him all that much either. So with Zaire coming in, the only way he starts and the only way you need to play him is if you cater the offense to him. If you're not going to do that, then it is just a waste of your time and a waste of his time. So I think it's the right move with Felipe Franks. We'll see much more of the same playbook we've seen the last couple of years, especially last year with Del Rio and Austin Appleby and going back to Will Greer. So that's the type of offense we see, and we'll see if we'll get that production.
A couple more questions for David Waters of Gator Breakdown here on Michigan Podcast, looking ahead to this week's now. Game week's already here. This week's Titanic showdown at Jerry World between Michigan and Florida, 3:30 Eastern kickoff. The suspensions. Now, 8 players suspended. My understanding, though, most of these are guys that weren't going to factor prominently on the depth chart for this game, except for one name, Antonio Callaway, who's really been the face of the offense at Florida the last couple of years. How big of a loss is he? Is it true that these aren't guys that we're going to figure him aside, weren't going to figure prominently in the game plan on Saturday? But here's where it does concern me. It reminds me of what happened at Notre Dame right before the season started last year when, they had a team leader in the secondary, a unit that was going to be very young. And right after camp was over, he got caught doing things he shouldn't have been doing with younger players, got suspended, and the defense never really recovered from that. They lost that opening game to Texas, made Shane Buechele look like Colt McCoy, and we were off. And is that a worry for Florida fans that where's the leadership, where's the chemistry at on this team when you're having an off season like that right now?
Yeah, with Callaway, this is not the first time we've dealt with off-field issues with Callaway. I don't think he was necessarily ever counted on to be a leader, just a really good player and probably your best player overall. Where this doesn't hurt Florida is it's an if situation. If Florida gets good quarterback play, Florida has enough receivers to where this isn't that big of a deal. But what we've seen the last couple of years, Florida hasn't had good quarterback play, and he's been the only player that can consistently make a defense game plan for him. So if Florida gets subpar quarterback play again, where do they go for a play? Now, you've seen hits and misses with other players like Tyree Cleveland last year against LSU, backed up on the own 2-yard line. It's a 98-yard bomb, and that's basically the difference in the LSU game. So you have a few other, Brandon Powell's been a consistent underneath player to help move the chains with this offense, but it hasn't been a consistent playmaker like Callaway. So if Felipe Franks, Malik Zaire, Luke Del Rio can get into a groove and find these other receivers, then it's not that big of an issue. But if the offensive line can't block and they're struggling to find a playmaker, Callaway was that guy they could count on.
What is Michigan underestimating, David? Tell Michigan fans what about your team you think is going to be stronger than maybe a lot of the preseason analysts, pundits, are pontificating. Is it Jordan Scarlett, the running back behind an offensive line that they've spent 3 years investing in building that unit? That you're right. When he took over, they had 6 scholarship players, and this is expected to be the year that they finally come into their own. So is it that? Where should Michigan fans be worried in your view?
The offensive line still scares me with this Michigan front. I have to see it before I believe it with this Florida offensive line. I'm a big fan of Jordan Scarlett. It's just he gets very little help there from the offensive line. So I think I probably have to move to the other side of the ball and go with the Florida secondary. Yes, they're inexperienced, but they brought in some big-time freshmen who will be Marco Wilson, C.J. Henderson, Brad Davis, and Stewart Brad Stewart along that secondary. These true freshmen will be counted on to play, and I think this Florida secondary, with the reputation they have, DBU there, it is kind of a plug and play. We saw Chauncey Gardner last year in the bowl game against Iowa, who's had a big pick six return for a touchdown, and you have Nick Washington, the other safety back there, who's very, very senior laden, a guy they can count on. So I think in Duke Dawson, who now moves from the nickel as the number one cornerback spot, I just think Florida has enough pieces there that they can count on. It won't be a big drop off. Florida's recruited well there, and Florida, for the most part, you go back to 2007 was probably the last time they played Michigan in a bowl game where they've had a subpar defense. It's not many times you could go back and look at a Florida defense that hasn't been ready to play, and it really starts with that secondary.
You have a prediction for us before we wrap this up?
When all things are equal and it kind of seems pretty close, that's where I will say my bias takes over. So I will say Florida in a close one, 24-21.
Hey, thanks for joining us today, David. We really appreciate it. How can fans follow you if they want to?
You can follow me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC and at Gators Breakdown for the Gators Breakdown podcast. Podcast a couple times a week. So plenty of Michigan talk, and we'll have you on later this week as well. So the Michigan fans can check that out. We'll have some Q&A session for you. Looking forward to that. David Waters from Gator Breakdown. Thank you, David. Good luck on Saturday, just not too much. All right, thank you. All right, take care. More Michigan podcast here in a moment. Now, one of the great things about the dawn of every college football season is it's like Christmas morning, opening your presents, right? I mean, I love the NFL, but not many of the big-name players in the league turn over on a roster in a given year, right? You know right now. I mean, we know right now what, at least if you're a Lions fan, and my sympathies because I'm one too, and I am ashamed. If you're a Lions fan, you pretty much know right now who 70% of the players are going to be on the 2018 team. And that's true of all the other 32 teams in the NFL. That's not, though, how college football works, right? I saw a stat this week, for example, that 4 of the last 8 Heisman Trophy winners didn't even have preseason Vegas odds. They were off the board. Cam Newton was off the board, okay? Last year's winner, Lamar Jackson, was 100-1 in the preseason to win it. In fact, the only person who picked Lamar Jackson to win the Heisman last year, Desmond Howard of the Michigan Wolverines. All right, so that's what's so cool about college football are the newcomers, the guys that we didn't know about, we weren't sure about, who take the sport by storm, and we get the first glimpse of that in this opening week of the season. So I wanted to take a look at who those newcomers could be for the Wolverines. Now, the first thing, though, we need to do is define newcomer. What does newcomer mean? So for the purposes of this exercise, let's define newcomer as someone who hasn't played a meaningful snap yet on either offense or defense for Michigan. So they could have played some special teams, right, but not and garbage time, but not a meaningful snap on offense or defense. Let's start with the offense. I think Tariq Black and Donovan Peoples-Jones are going to be major impact players at wide receiver. Well, Steve, you just said you were neutral in the receivers. Well, they're going to be major impact guys. I don't know that they're going to be 1,000-yard receivers, okay? But I think one of those guys is probably going to be close to leading the team in receiving yards at around 500 to 700 yards a game. It's not that I think these guys
aren't going to be great. I just think the hype train's getting a little ahead of ourselves before they play a snap. But I think those guys will definitely make major impacts. I think you'll see guys like Oliver Martin and Nico Collins play as well. On the offensive line, Cesar Ruiz, Steve Spinellis, John Runyon Jr., Nolan Aluzio. I think these are all guys that you're going to see get quality minutes as newcomers in year one. I think Chuck Filiaga, the prize recruit out of Texas, maybe just a year away, because I think those other guys have passed him up in fall camp. Some other newcomers, I think redshirt freshman Kareem Walker, a year away at tailback. But I suspect we're going to see him a lot on special teams, like kick return, for example. I would look for him there. Now let's go to the defense. I think Devin Bush and Khaleke Hudson are going to be studs. I think one of those guys is going to be all Big Ten. Second team, maybe. I think both those guys are going to have huge years. Now we go to the secondary. It's a bit of a jumble, but a lot of those guys some of those guys played spot minutes on defense last year. So who do I think makes an impact there? I think you look at guys who haven't played a meaningful snap. So you look at Ambry Thomas. I think you look at Benjamin St. Just. You look at Jalen Kelly Powell. Those are really your only technical newcomers, according to the standard that we're laying out there. And so I think you'll see those guys make an instant impact. It's just a question of how big of an impact they'll make and how quickly. But that's one of the great things about every college football season. In fact, let me throw one more in there. Now let's go to the defensive line. Expect to see guys like Carlo Kemp and Aubrey Solomon. They're going to be this year's Rashawn Gary and Chase Winovich. All right, so Solomon's going to be this year's Rashawn Gary. Kemp will be this year's Chase Winovich. Those are going to be guys that are depth guys that when they get in there, though, you're going to know they're in there. They're going to flash, they're going to make an impact, and they're going to make plays. Finally, I think the most underrated newcomer is Quinn Nordin. I mentioned this earlier in the podcast. Place kickers traditionally have a lot of scoring opportunities on Harbaugh teams, and we're just not a team, I think, that's going to have the margin for error, at least not early on, that we had last year. We had talent and experience. So we must be sound in the kicking game. All right, back here on Michigan Podcast, this week's Twitter poll question, well, that's a tad one-sided. We asked you to predict the outcome of the Michigan-Florida game. None of you predicted Florida win by less than a field goal. 7% of you predicted Florida win by more than a field goal. Only 5% of you said Michigan would not cover that 3-point spread. 88% of you think Michigan's going to win this game by a field goal or more. I hope you're right, man. Season opening losses suck. You wait 8 months for a game and then you lose. Those are the worst. All right, this week's question of the week comes from Oscillator via thewolverine.com, who asks us, isn't a sure sign the receivers are good that the coaches were so confident in the freshmen they moved Drake Harris to corner and Maurice Ways is a ways down the depth chart? Oscillator makes a decent point there. I think that's a bit of a hint. Obviously, I mean, Drake Harris, for example, by some accounts was the number one high school receiver in the country. The number one high school receiver in the Midwest by several services. So big-time recruit, struggled to stay healthy. But yeah, the fact that they've moved him to corner and try to create for him an entirely different position this late in his career does indicate they think there's more playing time for him there than receiver. But again, and I'm not trying to be a negative Nancy, all right? I'm just trying to keep it real, yo. Remember, this time of year, until you play another team, everything good is at the expense of something bad of your team. And everything bad is at the expense of something good. So sure, you could say that Drake Harris being moved to corner is emblematic of the depth and talent that Harbaugh and staff think they have at receiver. Could also be emblematic of the depth and talent they don't think they have at defensive back, right? So it works both ways. I'm not trying to be a negative Nancy, just trying to keep it real. All right? More of Michigan Podcast in a moment.
Michigan Podcast Trivia. When was the last time Michigan football won a...
And finally, you've noticed I'm rocking the Maze, right? This is the old Nike Maze alternate jersey that Michigan actually never wore, but they did sell for $79.99 retail. Not that I'm bitter. There are, however, now these maize jerseys that they are going to wear. Nike announced over the weekend Michigan and Florida will be doing their version of those NFL color rush games you see on Thursday nights. Florida's going with all blue, so it's essentially Florida's uniform that we've seen them wear a million times. But what you're watching now on the video will be the all-maize Michigan uniform. Now, let me say this. I think the tops are sweet. But the yellow on yellow, blue pants. Now, I get, though, Florida going all blue, you couldn't do that, right? But I could see that being a thing with a maize top and a blue pant. I could see that being a thing. Now, people are losing it. Oh, this is the home uniform. It's not the home uniform. Remember, we're technically the road team in this game, all right? So we are not forsaking those beautiful, arguably greatest uniform in college sports, blue jersey with maize pants. We are not forsaking that for this game. We were never wearing them in this game. We are wearing these instead of the all-white road uniforms, okay? And Florida's look pretty good too. It's just we've seen Florida wear those uniforms a million times. So here, it comes down to this, man. If you win, you love them. If not, burn them. Never wear them again. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at Michigan Podcast. Subscribe here on YouTube. Get us over 1,000 subscribers this week. Please subscribe for Detroit Sports Podcast via iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play as well. Don't forget to check us out later this week on Patreon. You'll get my picks for week 1 of college football as well as Saturday's Instant Reaction podcast after hopefully a victory over the Gators. We'll see you next week.